Communism. Well, I think there hasn't been a more misunderstood, misrepresented, maligned term in history. It's not hard to see why. The ruling class in our society preaches constantly, in many different ways, a common idea. There is no alternative. They've been saying this for a long time, and it's increasing, especially now. You probably noticed this. Actually, the main objection that we get is not a different idea. It's cynicism. People think there isn't another way. Actually, a lot of people think we're just going to let the world burn. But this is not the end of the world. It's not the end of society. And we don't have to watch the world go to hell. This is actually a common thing that has happened every time a socioeconomic system enters into decline. All of the crazy events that we're seeing around the world are quite characteristic of a system that has entered a senile decline. So a communist is someone who believes that there is an alternative. And we don't apologize for that. We do believe there is an alternative, and we have confidence and hope, unlike most people, I think, in society that are, I think there's a phenomenon of depression, actually, and hopelessness. But we don't just believe there's another way, an alternative. It's not a faith-based argument, right? It is based on a study of history. And if you do study history, you will know that actually capitalism hasn't been around that long. Contrary to what is continually argued against all fact and against all logic, capitalism is not natural. It has only existed for a few hundred years. And prior to capitalism's existence, you had feudalism. Prior to feudalism, you had slavery, and so on. So human society has organized itself in many different ways over the course of the last several thousand years. So yes, it is possible to organize society in a different way. And anyone saying it isn't, I think, is either ignorant or fooling somebody, trying to play a game. So yes, communists are simply people that believe there is another way, a better way of organizing society. And actually, the vast majority of the history of humans, modern humans that have existed, as a species, we've existed for a few 100,000 years. Through the vast majority of that, this has been confirmed by modern anthropology. Humans lived in a communal way, actually. Only fairly recently, in the last 10,000 years probably, when you had class society, you had slaves and slave masters, you had serfs and lords, and now you have workers and capitalists. Until fairly recently have you had this type of society, and you have had, with class society has come these types of problems. And capitalism is actually a massive acceleration of all those problems. Now, okay, that's all well and good. I'm explaining there has been different systems. That doesn't really help us explain how do we change the world, right? Well, one of the greatest contributions of Karl Marx was his analysis of how society can change, of how when a social economic system rises, it actually comes into being because it develops the productive forces of humanity. And it plays a certain function. And capitalism actually, contrary to what some right-wingers think, Marx actually spent a lot of his time analyzing how amazing capitalism was in history. Compared to feudalism, it was an amazing advance in Europe, right? It was, by any metric you can see. We're sitting here in a modern university, actually, in the main because of that. But what Marx described is an economic system, a class-based economic system, has inherent contradictions and antagonisms built into its very framework, and these contradictions eventually bring about its demise. And when a socioeconomic system is unable to develop the productive forces of humanity, and I believe we are now seeing that with capitalism. When a system is unable to develop the productive forces of humanity, it enters decline. Actually, you saw this, any history nerds here, you saw this with the Roman Republic that became the Roman Empire and entered into a decline because the slave mode of production reached its limits. And with it, you had immense turmoil. You had immense class struggle. You had an ideological crisis, actually, eventually led to the rise of Christianity in society. That's all very common with the collapse of a system. And eventually that collapsed, and that gave way to feudalism. But yeah, so capitalism, I believed, has reached its limits. It is unable to develop society any further. I think many people can see that, not just Marxists, not just communists. You can see it in many different things. I'll get into a few things. When a system can't develop the productive forces, the impact that has throughout society, living conditions start to decrease. Is that familiar to anyone here? Maybe, maybe not. But for many people in the world, it is. Canada, when I was raised in Canada, my parents told me that Canada is one of the best countries in the world to be born in. And we got free health care, and you can get a good job and have good living conditions, and you can buy a house, and They didn't foresee the future. But now, my generation was the first generation that lived at a lower living standard than our parents. And now the younger generations are living at an even lower living condition. And Canada is, I think, one of the best that capitalism had to offer the world, along with some European countries and whatnot. And this is happening all over. It's happening in Denmark. It's happening in Sweden. Anyone who brings the argument that you have this nice Scandinavian socialism over there somewhere, if you actually look at the situation, the same things are happening there. They're cutting social services. They're attacking unions. They're privatizing. This is what capitalism does in crisis when it is unable to develop things. They can't develop the productive forces, so they go for privatizing the healthcare system to make a profit, attack unions to bring down the cost of labor. Capitalism finds a way to make profit out of anything. And this is what we're seeing, and the consequences of that situation are massive political convulsions. Emily mentioned the liberal world order being dead. It's essentially dead. I believe it is. This is an example. Why is that? It's because the system is in crisis. It's not just because of Donald Trump. He is a massive accelerator, that is true, but he's also a symptom. Why did Donald Trump succeed in getting elected? Because there's an immense amount of anger in society. There's a lot of poor people that voted for Donald Trump. He played off that. People were angry at the Democrats. But yeah, this is all just examples of the immense radicalization, polarization, turmoil, the political turmoil, the wars, the environmental destruction are all hallmarks of a system that is entering or has entered its decline. And I think when you take that as your starting point, none of this stuff that's happening is confusing. It all makes sense, actually. If you don't understand the big picture, then the world is an extremely confusing place. Why is all this stuff happening now? This is a very strange epoch. I grew up in the 90s. This is not what the 90s was like. In the 90s, the bourgeoisie were preaching the end of history. There were no revolutions. Liberalism was triumphant everywhere. This was the epoch of Jean Chrétien, of Bill Clinton, of Tony Blair. This is what that was. This is no longer the case. You don't have stability and establishment liberals, you have polarization and radicalization everywhere. So yes, this is exactly what you would expect from a dying system. So the Revolutionary Communist Party, this fall, we launched a recruitment campaign. You may have seen our posters. I imagine many of you here. We had 5 posters, stickers, that we put up on around 50 campuses and in different neighborhoods and places all over. And we knew that out there is millions and millions of, especially young people, but everyone, getting radicalized by the crisis of the system. But the way that people get radicalized is they get radicalized by specific issues usually. So we picked some, the main ones, we think. The slogans we went with: we are poor because they are rich. The rich are killing the planet. Capitalism means war. You can't have capitalism without racism. And revolution against the billionaires. As some bold, sharp statements about the main radicalizing events or key issues that everyone is familiar with. And we use that, and I hope people were drawn to us because of this here, I imagine. I believe these issues, every single one of them, is a very good reason to be a communist. And if you logically look through these issues and why there are these levels of problems in each one of these, it is an inescapable conclusion that the capitalist system is at the root of it. And the only way to get rid of, or to solve any of these problems, is a revolution to change the mode of production, to change the type of, the way we organize society. That's really what communism is all about. So yeah, we believe ultimately that all of these horrible things are not just happening randomly. They're not just the cause of a couple of bad individuals. That would make sense if it was a one-off, but if you noticed, for years, it's just again and again and again. And it's obviously, how many data points do you need for a trend here? We live in an epoch of capitalist crisis and revolution. So the first issue, we are poor because they are rich, inequality and poverty. Well, I think that Canada that my parents told me about when I grew up is a thing of the past. It is a thing of the past. Everybody knows it. Do I even need to produce statistics? I think everyone knows it innately. You know it in your grocery bill, in your rent. Everybody knows that we're living poorer and poorer. But that's not controversial. I think everyone knows that. The question is, why? And that's where you might get into some arguments, right? With some people. So most people, I think, are willing to sacrifice if need be. Like, maybe one of your parents lost their job. The family you're going to eat a little less of something expensive. You're going to constrain your budget, right? But really, what's been asked of working class people over the past, 10, 15 years is you need to pay. Not everyone, though. Working class people have to pay. Your wages are not going to keep up with inflation. Good jobs are few and far between. Tuition is more expensive. Rent, housing is a big one. That a Canadian dream that you could get a house is out of reach for most people unless you have support of some sort from your parents or something like that, or unless you come from a rich family. But for the vast majority of people, for working class people, it is essentially impossible. So undeniably, life has gotten worse for the vast majority of people. But and everybody, I think people will sacrifice if they feel as though everyone's sacrificing. But I think an anger that's developed in our society is that they can see that not everyone is sacrificing. They can see that while we're getting poor, actually the acceleration of the enriching of the billionaires and the top percentile of society has rapidly increased. You could do some basic math, and you're like, well, there's anyone with half a brain can see that there's been a transference of wealth from the bottom half to the top percentiles. And any statistics will show you this. And that's not surprising, because that's also what capitalism produces in a period of decline. So I'll give some stats in case you don't believe me. In the world, 8 billionaires, just 8, own as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. In Canada, you might say, oh, that's the world, though. Canada's different, right? We're more middle class. In Canada, the richest 20% own 64.7% of all the wealth, while the bottom 40% only own 3.3%. And at the very top of society, there are 76 billionaires. Actually, in Canada, there's a billionaire being created, I think, every day or so. And last year, their total wealth was $500 billion, which is about a quarter, I believe it's about a quarter of the Canadian economy. And the total wealth is $500 billion of these 76 billionaires, and it grew just last year by $190 billion. That's that acceleration of a giant mountain of gold being hoarded on one side of society. Yes. So we're seeing, and we're also seeing, I think we've all seen this somewhere on social media, the almost gloating about it that comes from the top of society, the billionaires. Obscene displays of wealth while everyone's suffering. Probably the best example is our good friend Jeff Bezos' wedding. He bought a $100 million yacht as a support yacht for his $500 million yacht that all the rich people went on and celebrated his wedding. I don't know what a support yacht is, but whatever. That was quite damning. You know this? You ever hear this argument? We've heard it actually this week. Some rich kids tried to tell me that capitalism lifts all boats. Actually, most of us don't have a boat. A lot of us are drowning. And that's quite clear when you don't have your head stuck up somewhere. So yes, we are poor. More people are becoming poorer and having trouble, not because we're lazy, not because working class people are stupid, not because of avocado toast or whatever the latest thing is that they're blaming it on. We are poor because they are rich, and them becoming more rich is us becoming more poor. It's quite a simple calculation. Total wealth in Canada, all wealth, is $19 trillion. If that was shared equally, that would be $460,000 per person. More than enough to guarantee a good standard of living for all. We could eliminate poverty, inequality, all the major problems that we have, hunger, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just saying that because it's not a question, oh, there's not enough. That's not the question. Sometimes capitalists try to argue that. There's not enough stuff. No, that is not the issue. It's a question of distribution. In terms of, so that's just basics of poverty and inequality. The billionaires, like there's this tiny layer of billionaires that play a huge role. They control the economy, but they also control society, I believe. They have immense control over the governments of the world. For example, probably the most glaring examples everyone all knows, America. Just last year, the billionaires spent $2 billion on U.S. presidential and congressional elections for both the Democrats and the Republicans. A lot of them funded both Trump and Kamala Harris, actually, because they want to guarantee that whoever gets elected, they get their way. And actually, they always get their way. In Canada, you could say, that's different. We got laws that determine you can't do that. True. There are laws that say that billionaires can't just buy an election like that. But I believe it's when you look at the fundamentals, it's fundamentally the same, because the politicians, the bankers, the bureaucrats, the businessmen, they're all part of the same club. And guess what? You're not in it. None of us are. If you notice what happens when a prime minister or a minister of the government quits politics, what happens? Just look it up. You can look up anyone. Some company, some big company goes, we're going to get that person to work for us. Why would they do that? Well, that person's probably got the prime minister on speed dial. It's a very good lobbying. And that's essentially what happens in Canada. There's an example of that, Jean Chrétien. Pretty much every ex-prime minister works for a big oil company or a big, massive company, and they end up getting contracts. I wonder why. So I see, no matter what the campaign finance laws are, the billionaires, the capitalists, control the government either way. And it's not just because they lobby them either. Actually, this is a fundamental thing. I think sometimes we focus too much on elections. All the major decisions made in our society are not made in the parliament. They're made in boardrooms with billionaires and their lackeys. All the major decisions, what's produced, how the economy functions, what type of factories they want to open, all this stuff is all done in private boardrooms, not democratically. We don't have a say in that. That's how capitalism functions. And if any government comes in, it is possible, technically we have a democracy, or what Marx would call a bourgeois democracy. You get to vote once every 4 years for a guy in a suit, a rich guy in a suit usually, and they end up doing almost the same thing every single time. Even when you elect a so-called left-wing party, you can elect a left-wing party. Well, because the billionaires control the economy, they submit that party. They force them to stop anything that endangers the profit of the capitalists. They do it every time. And unless that party is prepared to actually take the fight to the billionaires and to the capitalists, they will be forced to capitulate. Just a couple examples. François Hollande in France, he was a socialist who was elected in 2010, I think it was. He came in on the promise to raise corporate taxes, or raise the taxes on the super rich. What do you think? Do you think he did it? No, he did not. There was capital flight. Billionaires started pulling their money out of their economy, crashing the French economy. And so he was like, oh, Jesus, freaked out, and went back on it. Closer to home, Bob Rae, everyone in Ontario, well, maybe people might be too young to remember that, but it's kind of a scandalous little event. The NDP was elected in the 1990s on a pretty progressive program. They promised a bunch of reforms, things like this. The unions basically funded them, their campaign, and there was a massive sabotage campaign from the big companies, the millionaires, and Bob Rae eventually was forced to capitulate on his program. They sabotaged the economy. They were prepared to do that to wreck the government. And then they got Mike Harrison, who was conservative, and he started implementing cuts. This is just some of the ways that the billionaires, the big capitalists, get their way. So yeah, they use their control over the economy. They control the media. They set the narratives. You notice how the mainstream media will address certain issues. Probably the most glaring one has been Palestine. They'll say like, oh, hospital got destroyed somehow. We don't know, It's like everyone knows, like it was bombed by the IDF, But they can't say that because Israel has been a historical ally of Canadian imperialism. So they're not going to talk poorly about their ally. But yeah, they control the media, the billionaires, the capitalists. They set the political narratives, the debates. They censor things. They kind of control what is allowed in the mainstream discourse. And I think this leads to one thing. I mentioned the 5 slogans. So here I've demonstrated we have this immense inequality. You have this thin layer at the top getting richer as we're getting poorer. You have this big billionaires that control the politics, that control society. How are they able to do that? Actually, in the world, there's just 3,000 billionaires in the whole world. What's the world population? It's like almost 8 billion, I think. They hold immense wealth. It's $16 trillion, which is more than the economies of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, South Africa, Nigeria, or Egypt, which are some of the most populous countries in the world. And these 3,000 billionaires play a dominant role in controlling what happens in the world. But that's just 3,000 people. Why doesn't the big fish eat the little fish? Well, they don't just dominate us economically. They don't just dominate us with violence, although they do. They control the state, They need ideas, and they need to convince a part of the population that it's okay. This is where racism comes in. So one of the slogans we had is, you can't have capitalism without racism. This is a quote from Malcolm X, who was a great revolutionary in the 1960s in the US, who, he famously said that. And that is a very profound idea. Because I think in our society, it's very common for liberals to detach ideas from their economic base. They detach the question of racism from the question of capitalism, as if racism is just a random bad idea floating around in the air. But as Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. And it does perform an extremely useful function for the ruling class. They need to justify what they're doing. Why in Canada? By all measures, Indigenous people make up, they're 5% of the population. They make up 28% of all inmates in the prisons. By all levels of income, Indigenous people make far less money. Levels of poverty are through the roof on reserves, for example. How do you justify that? Racism. It's a very useful idea. It's something wrong with them, obviously. You hear the same type of arguments from the right wing in the U.S. about black people. Why is this happening? Why is there, it's they use this argument. It's cultural, which is sort of just a sneaky way of being racist. Racism justifies, in Canada, hyper-exploitation of immigrant workers, brutalization of black people by the police. You're 10 times as likely to get, twice as likely to get shot by the police if you're black in Canada, in Toronto, actually. You're 10 times as likely to be shot if you're Indigenous. It's an age-old divide and rule tactic. Why is there a housing crisis? We've all heard this, right? It's the immigrants. Why are there no good jobs? The immigrants are taking all the jobs. Who said that? Well, Pierre Poilievre said it. But Justin Trudeau also said it. The Liberals said it too. Carney's more or less said that. They're all pursuing an anti-immigrant policy. And they're blaming the immigrants. And it's a useful thing because they can blame one section of the working class, and instead of the workers uniting against the capitalists, who are the real culprit, the real person laying people off and causing job losses is not the immigrant. It's the big CEO and the billionaire. Racism also plays a useful role because it justifies capitalism's drive towards imperialist war and domination. I remember 9/11, and I remember what started happening before the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan was this kind of sneaky little, sometimes not so sneaky, sometimes it was just blatant. They're like, what's up with Muslims? And they created this Islamophobic, racist, frankly, narrative in the media. And why were they doing that? Because they needed to justify what they were about to do, which was hundreds of thousands of dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, right, with the invasion and the war. So racism also, it plays a useful role because it convinces the population at home that it's okay to just massacre a bunch of people overseas. That's why I think also even what I'd say is like a social question like racism. If you follow it, the roots, you can't detach it from the economics, and you can't detach it from the function that it performs for the ruling class, which is dividing the workers and making it easier for the billionaires to rule. On the question of war, because I raised it, I think we've all become very well aware of this recently. War and conflict are spreading like a plague around the world. There's the genocide in Gaza. There's the war in Ukraine. There's lesser-known wars all over the place. There's a war in Sudan that's actually quite brutal, for example. How can we explain this? I also believe this is not random or the result of bad individuals. The great Russian revolutionary Lenin wrote a book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And he describes imperialism as a stage in the development of the capitalist system where free markets have given way to monopoly. And actually, you have this in every major country. In Canada, for example, 5 banks dominate finance. There's a handful of big mining companies. There's 4 telecom giants. There's 3 oil barons. There's 3 media companies, essentially. There's like a few grocery giants, et cetera, et cetera. And imperialism is also a stage where the banks fuse with industrial capital and create what Lenin described as finance capital, which acts in unison for their common interests. Because if a bank lends a whole bunch of money to a mining company, well, they have a direct interest in making sure that mining company is profitable. I'm mentioning mining because I didn't have numbers for last year or this year, but 2023, Canadian mining companies had $220 billion in assets outside of Canada. Actually, most of their assets aren't in Canada. They're in Africa, Latin America, places like this. And the banks and the big mining companies, they have an interest in this being profitable for them, right? And they control the state. And the Canadian government always supports the interests of the Canadian banks and the Canadian mining companies and other companies. And out of this comes conflict between countries and eventually, when it comes to it, war and conflict. Because what you have now is a small number of imperialist nations suck the wealth out of the rest of the world. Just a couple examples. Oxfam had a study last year where they said the global north, that basically just means Europe, Canada, America, controls 69% of the wealth, even though it's only 21% of the population. And Canada is part of this Western imperialist alliance. And specifically with Canada, the richest 1% in Canada were paid $7.2 million per day just through the financial system from the global south. That's a very clear example of imperialism. I already mentioned the thing about Canadian mining companies. From this you have this search for resources, cheap labor, and markets abroad. You have conflict between countries. And as there's a famous quote from Karl von Clausewitz where he said, he was a Prussian military theorist like a couple hundred years ago, and he said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And that is precisely what we're seeing. Now, Lenin added on to this. He said politics is concentrated economics. So the politics of a country are determined by the economics, and then the war is determined, whether or not a country goes to war is determined by the politics, which is essentially just an expression of the economic interest, if you want to simplify it. And this is why we have war under capitalism. And also, war is insanely profitable. There's a huge military-industrial complex, and no matter who wins in the war, they always win. And this isn't just an American thing either, by the way. I think a lot of people in Canada, because there's this myth told to us that we're a peacekeeping nation, right? It's a myth. It's a complete myth. It's false. There is a military-industrial complex in Canada, and if you invested $1,000 last year in what they call them defense sectors. Defense. It's funny. Defense. What is it? Offense sector. They produce missiles and bombs and military vehicles. If you invested $1,000 in that last year, you would have a pretty good return. You'd have about $1,400. 40% return in 1 year. Now, any advisor that's going to advise you where to invest your money, they would probably advise you to put it there. That's a better rate than you're going to get almost anywhere. And why is that happening? Well, if we're probably all aware, maybe you haven't noticed, all of the Western imperialist countries are increasing their military spending to the highest rates since World War II. Actually, Melanie Joly said, a minister in the government said, this is a wartime government. I was like, wartime government? What the hell are you talking about? We're not at war. What's going on? So yeah, they're increasing military spending from about 40 billion in Canada to 150 billion. And, some people say, oh yeah, well that's bad, but, we got to defend ourselves. That doesn't really have anything to do with me. That's just defending the country against maybe an evil other country, Well, it does have a lot to do with you, because how is Carney paying for it? Well, he's instructed all of the departments to enact 15% cuts across the board. They've now, just this past week, started using the word austerity measures and admitting that there will be massive job losses. So the healthcare and education systems that are already in a sorry state in many provinces are going to be worse. There is going to be less good jobs available because a lot of these are unionized jobs in the public sector that many university-educated people, I don't know if you're expecting to get a job like that, but quite often that's what happens. There'll be less of that available. There'll be more crap jobs. So yes, what's happened is these military contractors, there's a literal bonanza, and they're just making tons of money. They're getting tons of contracts. Carney's giving them billions of dollars in military contracts. This is where Lenin said, war is a terrible thing. Yes, but it is a terribly profitable thing. And that is one thing that we highlight as Marxists. So I am needing to wrap up soon, but there's a couple other things I want to talk about first. The one that I haven't touched on is the environment. I think this is a very good reason to be a communist, and I'll explain why. I think everyone here has probably been politicized or radicalized in some way by the climate crisis. I don't even say climate change, I say climate crisis because it is a crisis. The 10 hottest years on record are now the last 10. The hottest year was last year, actually. It's gone from bad to worse, and a lot of people would wonder why, when there's been a consensus for a while now, a near consensus. There's some crazy yahoos that still don't believe it, but overwhelming massive consensus. In the world, 80% of the population of the world, there was a study done, believes in climate change and believes we need to take drastic action. So why is nothing happening? But I think if you're a communist, this is not surprising. Because what so-called solutions to solve this have been implemented? Well, one, I think we've all probably encountered this. This is very prevalent on university campuses. We've been lectured about our individual carbon footprint and individual things that we all must do. Now I'm raising this, that for the ruling class has always been an extremely convenient thing. Because what does it do? It shifts the blame. Who's to blame? Not the big company that's actually responsible for the vast majority of all pollution. You, who can change almost nothing. Now, I'm not opposed to you making individual changes in your life or recycling or something like that. I'm just saying that was never a solution to the problem. It was a sneaky way that the capitalists used to divert attention from the real issue. And according to Oxfam, 1% of the population emit as much planet heating pollution as the bottom 2/3. That is the fundamental truth. The governments in some countries, like Canada, have implemented some climate policies, but all of their policies have had the same defect. They've all maintained private ownership over the economy. They've kept the control in the hands of the billionaires, and they've kept their profits intact. Everything that they've implemented has respected their right to make profit. It has not attacked the profit motive. Things like the carbon tax, cap and trade, things like the EV mandate. Actually, Elon Musk loves the EV mandate. He loves it. Electric vehicle mandate. You get a little subsidy for basically buying a car from him. I'm not sure that's a solution. I don't think it is. So yeah, all of the policies and everything argued had the same defect. It actually protected capitalism didn't threaten capitalism, and it didn't solve the problem. And now what's happening in country after the country? They're all removing all of these ineffective climate policies. Mark Carney axed the carbon tax on April 1st. And if you think that was just a liberal thing, well, the first province to introduce a carbon tax was British Columbia, and the NDP government there, which is a supposedly left-wing government, axed the carbon tax there too. You have all of the major Canadian banks had signed on to this zero emissions alliance that Carney had actually created when he worked for the UN, and they've all exited it now, as Carney is prime minister. What does this say? The bourgeoisie actually never cared about that to begin with. They were just posturing politically to try to fool us, and they unfortunately fooled a lot of people. But yeah, so I feel like this has left a lot of people feeling quite depressed and demoralized. There's doomerism. There's this eco-anxiety, almost a feeling of dread about the future, knowing that the planet won't survive, or thinking that the planet won't survive. I think this is probably best encapsulated by David Suzuki, who's probably the most well-known environmentalist in the country, who recently did an interview and said, it's too late. Now, because he's not a communist, he's essentially a liberal. He celebrated Justin Trudeau's election and then was confused when he bought a pipeline. He's called Mark Carney the most environmentally conscious prime minister we've ever had. And then he was like, oh, but he axed the carbon tax. Well, you know. And then he basically says, the problem's humanity, not capitalism. The problem's humanity. So communists, we don't believe that. We think the problem is not humanity. The vast majority of humanity wants to do something about it. The problem is capitalism stands in our way. And if we want to save the planet, we want to save the environment, want to protect the environment, we have to kill capitalism, actually. We have to put this system to death. I believe it's quite an absurd situation. We have all the modern technology in the world to solve this problem, but it can't be put to use because it is not profitable. And that is the fundamental truth to the environmental crisis. And that is why nothing actually fundamentally changed. That is why all these targets that they set at these stupid conferences, for lack of a better word, are never met because, frankly, they're not in control of things. The bourgeoisie is in control, and the bourgeoisie, it pays to pollute. So what is to be done? So now there are some individuals and parties that are tapping into this mood on the left and the right, frankly. I think sometimes there's right populists that speak to this anger in the working class. But I believe that only is able to actually have an effect when there's no genuine left-wing alternative. And we are seeing in some countries left-wing alternatives. You have Zoran Mamdani in New York, who will probably become mayor of one of the most important cities in the world, the most important city in America. He said, I don't think that we should have billionaires. I agree with that. Bernie Sanders has said billionaires should not exist. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has said a system that allows billionaires to exist is immoral. These are all American politicians. So great. So let's do something about it, right? So what do they propose? Because this is obviously the main problem. You got to hit at the crux of the problem. So Sanders' plan was to impose an 8% tax on wealth above $1 billion. Mamdani wants to increase taxes to 11.5% in New York on the corporate tax rate. But if you notice, I'm not opposed to increasing taxes on billionaires, of course, but these plans actually won't eliminate billionaires. And actually, all of them, because they are not proposing a different system. This is where the importance of being a communist comes in. If you are not a communist, you have to accept the rules of capitalism. These people, although some of them I think might be well-meaning, aren't proposing a new system, so they're forced to accept billionaires and the system. AOC said, I don't necessarily think that means all billionaires are immoral. So some of them are okay. She mentioned Bill Gates. He's an all right guy, right? Mamdani said he looks forward to working with everyone, including billionaires. So I think this is just a result of their proposals not attacking the root of the problem. So what is a billionaire? And why are they powerful? Well, they're not powerful because they control the government. I think that's a bit of a backwards way of looking at it. They control the government because they are powerful. They control the economy. And so unless we're tackling the problem at its root, we're not going to get rid of billionaires. They'll still maintain their grip over the economy, and they'll still maintain their grip over politics. And this cannot be done in a half-assed way, for lack of a better term. We must confront them seriously. It's not like, I'll increase the tax on you by 2%, you bastard. And then somehow the billionaire is going to die, you know? That's not how this works. Like I said previously, I think, theoretically we live in a democracy where you can elect some of these people. Like I said, Mamdani probably will get elected. But I believe under capitalism, the parliament is an illusion of choice. No matter what party is in power, billionaires control the economy and use this power to control the government. I think, and even when a left-winger gets in or elected somewhere, they're confronted with this reality. We saw this with, I think probably the best example is AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's betrayed on Palestine. She was pro-Palestine, then she supported sending military weapons to Palestine, to Israel, sorry. She betrayed on the railway workers' strike a few years ago. She supported a motion taking away their right to strike. Why? She's had to accept the rules of capitalism. I mentioned a couple of examples, Francois Hollande, Bob Rae in Ontario. There are many more. So unless we are communists and we are proposing a fundamentally different system, we have to accept capitalism for what it is. And at most, you might be able to tinker a little bit. But that window of opportunity is quickly closing. And I think many people see that. With capitalism in crisis, there is no fat in the system, and they are unable to actually offer any meaningful reforms. So I believe this is why you should be a communist. Capitalism is on its last legs. We should be confident this system is dying. And I think we should understand this as a part of a long historical process. As I mentioned at the beginning, many class societies have come and gone. There's been slavery, feudalism, etc. And every time these societies have entered into crisis, the old decrepit ruling class would be overthrown eventually. But then they would be replaced by a new ruling class. For example, when the bourgeoisie, which was a new ruling class, overthrew the old feudal aristocracy in Europe, in England or France. But I believe with capitalism, and this is where Marx's analysis comes in, with capitalism, for the first time, the laboring class, the class that works, not the idle class, the CEOs, the managers, or the lords, but the laboring class, the working class, can fight back and win. I believe that is the situation we're faced with. Karl Marx said in the manifesto that capitalism, above all else, creates its own grave diggers in the modern proletariat. And the working class is beginning to move in country after country after country, is rising up against exploitation, against oppression. And if there's anyone here that thinks a revolution is not possible, I would say I think you've been living under a rock. And actually, just a few days ago, a revolution broke out in Indonesia and is ongoing as poor workers and youth are fighting against a corrupt capitalist government. Now, revolution is inevitable. I think this process is going to produce many mass movements, many revolutions. But the question is, what comes out of it? So we believe that that's why we need to be communists. I think a lot of the left today, almost all the left, has abandoned the fight for a new society. They've accepted capitalism, essentially. They just believe to reform it a little bit. So they're very depressed because they can't see beyond the capitalist system. Well, we believe, and that's why you have this depression so prevalent in society and on the left, because people don't see hope. And they see left-wing parties betraying over and over and over. Well, we believe that's just because this is the nature of capitalism in crisis. And we must fight for a new system. We must fight for a new society. And we are building a party not like the other parties, actually. Sometimes I think people hear the word party and they go, oh, That's like a parliamentary. No, we're not talking about that. We're not coming to ask for a vote every 4 years. We're asking people to commit yourself to the fight for the liberation of humanity, to save the planet, and to fight for a better society. And I believe it's possible. I believe this epoch that we're living in provides us with those opportunities. And I believe we just need to build a force that is able to propose a new way for society. And I believe that's communism. And I hope I've covered enough ground to convince you, if you were on the fence, why you should be a communist. If you're not, please ask your questions in the discussion. But thank you very much.